Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Fourth Eye Podcast. This is your host, Orion Webster. So for today, I am, as I started in the last podcast, going to be relying a little bit on my outline here. I've just got a few bullet points and things that I kind of want to talk about today. So the topic for today is mindset for fulfillment and goal achievement, something like that. Probably be the title of this video as well. So first and foremost, I wanted to get into what motivated me to do this particular podcast. And the answer to that question is basically I have been sort of re-exposed to the idea of living in the moment, sort of just being versus constantly being lost in my anxieties and depression and things like that. And so what that means is being in the now has allowed me to get rid of the anxiety caused by worrying about things that have yet to happen and the depression or shame that can be caused by sort of reflecting or repeating past mistakes or experiences on a loop and kind of beating myself up for it. And what I found at the advice of Sam Harris, for those of you who are familiar, is that when I started kind of focusing on the now, and when I sort of got back into meditating, and I have done it before, but I haven't kept up a constant practice, and I think I'm going to change that because I really want to keep this state of kind of nirvana that I've found. But basically, I found that when I just made the simple shift of focusing on the now and sort of cutting off thoughts that were focusing on things that aren't happening to me right now, my stress and my fears immediately fell away in a way that I was totally not expecting. And no, I'm not trying to sell anything. No, this is not hyperbole. This really happened. And I'm sharing this not necessarily as a testimonial for anyone in particular or for Sam, but more so because it reminds me of the importance of where your head is at and your mindset and, what the state of your consciousness is insofar as it relates to the quality of your life. Because, what I realize is that I have a pretty good life now. If I'm looking at it externally, I have the things that I want. I have time. I don't have infinite money, but I don't really want for anything. And yet I am often, I don't want to say miserable because that's not accurate, but I'm often suffering or anxious or feeling sort of emotionally whacked out, if you will. I realized because I was spending a lot of my energy and my thought bandwidth on all of these things that aren't happening, all of these fears that never come true, and all of this shame and things, thinking about the past that I can't best act on by constantly being in this depressive state. And I'm sure that many of you have been in a similar position, being that we share a common humanity here, where you're kind of beating yourself up or you're really grieving something that's happened, something where you feel like you could have done a better job. And, honestly, it's like, it's easy to validate because you probably could have done something differently, although it isn't always obvious that that would have made things better. But the reality is it happened, it's done. We don't have a time machine. We're not going to accomplish anything by feeling sorry about it. And we best serve ourselves and those around us by being the happy, productive, fulfilled human beings that we want ourselves to be. So anyway, that sort of wraps up the motivation there in terms of why I'm doing this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about consciousness, which I've already mentioned, and this will, I suppose, end up touching on Sam Harris a few times, because he kind of opened me up again to this idea that I've heard him speak about before, but it resonates with me particularly at this moment. When he kind of talks about the fact that whether or not your relationships are good or bad, or the quality of your life and all these different things are merely a factor of the conscious minds that are involved in various things. You know, whether or not you are suffering or not, whether or not you are grateful or not, whether you're happy or not, is a matter of this conscious state. Now, of course, that's really obvious. But there's this other point that everything is arising in consciousness. And I take that in this point here that mindset is really important, in that all of these fears and anxieties become real when you constantly play those thoughts and those feelings over and over in your head, because they start to manifest in your life. You know, your life is a product of your consciousness. And in another way of putting that is that we are the quality of our thoughts. So if 99% of your thoughts don't make you a better person, then it would be very bizarre to expect that you will like your life, or that you will improve over time. And even if you're getting better financially, or if you're losing weight, or if your relationships from the outside looking in should be going well, the reason that we don't feel any of these successes that are happening is because that feeling doesn't come from the external world. And many of you have heard this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But I really think it is true that whether we are happy or sad or angry or glad, right, or grateful and all these different things, or anxious, is a matter of what we choose. You know, it's kind of this idea that comes from the Eastern traditions, or from Stoicism, which is sort of the Western version of it, that it's not what happens to you that creates suffering, it's how you react to it, it's how you think about it. And so what that also means is that, or the upside of that, is that happiness and fulfillment are not things that we get from meeting our goals. It's something that can be found at any time in a completely normal state of consciousness. It's not something that requires us to eat sugar, or to gamble, or to have sex, or entertain any of these things that can sort of cause us to get a rush of dopamine. We don't have to be addicts in order to feel something. That's what I'm saying. You know, we can be fulfilled finding this sense of peace and living in the moment. And I think it's really, really powerful. And I haven't done the experiment of sort of seeing if this works with a lot of other people. Certainly when I've talked about it with other people and they've tried to be more mindful of it, of, you know, family and friends, I've certainly seen a really big shift in just kind of how they are in the world, and how they react to people who cut them off in traffic, and just how much more calm they are. And, you know, when, you know, like, especially when you see children, you know, taking deep breaths and knowing exactly what to do when they're frustrated, it's really beautiful, because it really is an advantage in this world, especially with all the stimuli and all the potential stress, and the fact that, as everyone knows, we are creatures that are best adapted for survival, and we have negativity bias and these other things that are very good at keeping us alive in the short term, but very bad at making us enjoy our lives in the long term, and just generally. And so if we want to balance living a long life with happiness and fulfillment, we have to learn the skill of resisting and being more mindful. Resisting probably isn't the right word, but being more mindful and aware, and nudging away some of these sort of apish instincts that get us into trouble. So I think that's really important. The other thing I wanted to touch on a little bit, coming back to the more pragmatic side, or some of the theory, if you will, is kind of this difference between the growth mindset and the limited mindset, for those of you who've heard those terms. And I'm adding a third one in there, which is the limitless mindset. So something that occurs to me is that for this podcast and on the blog and just generally with the book that I'm writing, and a lot of the things that I think about, virtually everything that I've ever thought about converges on this single point, that it is always relevant to the minds involved. It's always relevant to consciousness. And more accurately, it's always relevant to mindset, right? So granted, this isn't particularly relevant to what I'd planned to do here, but, for instance, I'm writing about this problem that I'm seeing in movements that are emerging in modern times, specifically kind of here in the States, but, sort of more globally. And a lot of these things that are happening, and, it sort of occurred to me that the thing that's wrong with these movements like Black Lives Matter, as I perceive them anyway, not to get myself into too much trouble here for stating an unpopular opinion, but it's really mindset, right? It's the mindsets, clearly, and the states of the people that are in these movements. The angry people, the people vying for something like black supremacy, whether they realize it or not. And this is coming from a black person, mind you, so I'm allowed to say this. Sorry, that's my intersectionality boost. My cloak of intersectionality +2. But my point is that a lot of the things that I think are wrong and that I'm writing about come down to the states, the people in these movements. If they were in a state of peace and of gratitude and of charity, we would be approaching many of these problems that are real, right? The problem of inequality as it relates to gender and race and sexuality and these different things. Like, these are difficult topics that we should want to talk about, but we need to do one hell of a better job talking about them. And I think that starts with addressing mindset. So anyway, I think when you talk about a limited mindset, for better or for worse, this is the one that a lot of people find themselves with, and it's extremely damaging. Something I was just spending a bit thinking about is that I think, speaking for my experience of the United States, I think the United States, sort of post World War II, and sort of perhaps before and all this idea of the American dream, there used to be, or at certain periods in history, have been a sense that anybody can, through merit, really make it big, whatever the hell that means, be successful, right? Self-actualize. And I think that this is a sense that has been lost, right? A lot of people see the difference, and forgive the background noise there, that's my laptop making a ton of noise, apologies. But people see the difference between Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world at this moment, to my knowledge, and somebody working at 7-Eleven today, and they think that is a sign of some deep injustice or unfairness. And I think that's exactly the wrong way to look at that situation. Now, note, I'm not arguing that there isn't some level of inequality that won't cause problems down the road, because I think that is likely the case. But I don't feel comfortable for a moment saying that not only did Jeff not earn his money, but we should arbitrarily redistribute it to other people who are less good at contributing to the market. I don't think that makes sense. And I think there's a lot of people who would immediately see what's wrong with that. It wouldn't pass the smell test. But anyway, the point being that really, I think it comes down to mindset, right? Even if it is the case that people do have the ability to move between economic brackets or self-actualize and all this, if they don't think they do, that's still something worth talking about. I think it might be the case that we're at a time where a lot of people who basically should be working more economically and culturally and socially more significant jobs are ending up working in sort of these entry level and these low level, not in a derogatory way, but these kind of super blue collar jobs that they ought to not be working in because the system isn't working as promised. And I think a lot of people are miffed about that, if that's the correct word, pissed off or whatever. And I think that's worrying, because I think the last thing, or at least that I want, I suppose I can't speak for others, is to be living in a country where my goal is to meet my ambitions and to be successful. And I know on a personal level, because of my own mindset, which I can get into in a moment, I'm not going to stop at anything, ethics withstanding, of course, to sort of have my ambitions realized. But I realize that at scale, when you're talking to hundreds of millions of people or more, if we're talking more globally, really, there is a sense that there is probably some value, thinking about this in sort of mathematical terms, or some range of values, really, that would be totally unacceptable for the mobility that people have, and then some far more constricted domain of values that would be acceptable for how difficult it is to move between economic brackets. And I think we all kind of get that. And I don't know where we are at this moment. I feel like we may be outside the range of the acceptable, or at least from the perspective of, kind of pop culture. I think like many people don't feel like they have the degree of flexibility that they ought to have, that they'd like to have. And that's unfortunate because, again, that was sort of the promise, sort of the land of opportunity in all this. And so another thing that I would say is that, being that, as you probably know by now, I'm kind of an entrepreneur and an entrepreneurial-minded person, I understand that there will always be risk, and mostly, I would say, emotional risk that is involved with taking the plunge. Because what you have, people are familiar with the sort of model, is that there's really a series of valleys and peaks. And the thing is, in order to get to a peak, you have to go through a valley generally. And so people see the valley, they can't see the peak, and that is kind of normal. And they never begin the journey. And that's not something that I think we're going to get rid of, right? So rather than try to make the valleys less steep, and that might be worth doing as well, I think we should focus more on making people more able to handle the valleys and more expectant. I don't know if that's the right way of thinking about it, but more aware of the peak lying on the other side, such that they feel motivated to continue even during hard times. So I think some of it is that, whether it's our education system or kind of how we are at home, we have done a poor job of equipping people for the valleys. And I think what's happening now is that people think the best mode to act through is not self-improvement, but rather to sort of get in a group and wave placards in front of corporations and expect things to happen that way. And frankly, things don't happen that way, right? I think it's true that we have to address the systems that are broken, because ultimately systems and incentives and so on, you could say, are responsible ultimately for how things end up, generally speaking. But we also have to meet that halfway with really uplifting the individual and really expecting people to take ownership and accountability and say, hey, and this is going to be unpopular, but we have to be comfortable with saying, hey, you have type 2 diabetes, which is because, yes, there's a system that encourages people to not eat fat and to eat processed carbs, but it just is the case that you are the only one who can fix the fact that you have been eating too much sugar, that you've been drinking Diet Cokes, that you haven't been exercising, that you haven't been sleeping well. We have to start having that hard conversation. We have to start encouraging people to take accountability and stop trying to sort of outsource the difficulty of life onto a government or onto somebody else or onto some group. And I do think that this is at least in part what these movements are founded on. It's sort of this problem where people don't feel that they have any ability to make changes as individuals. They think the best mode to operate at is at the group level. And because of that, people are beginning to care more and more about their group identity and less about their individual identity. And as many of you will know, and as I personally believe, I think that the sovereignty of the individual is probably one of the most important things that you need for an effective, economically prosperous, and, society that is truly worth living in. And the collective is really the opposite of that. It generally just leads to hell. Making your group identity the most important thing about yourself is like the perfect way to descend into tribalism. It's not a very good idea when we have the weapons and technologies that are as powerful as the ones we have access to. But anyway, that's a little bit off topic for this, although not really, because that is the sort of practical side of where all this stuff is going. But anyway, so getting back to the different mindsets, you have the growth mindset, which is probably pretty self-explanatory, where you constantly want to get better. And obviously this is the one that we hear about, that we, would imagine maybe 2% of the population possesses. And then I would go on to say that there's probably some number of people that you could probably count, on your fingers and toes that have the limitless mindset. It's probably more than that. I'm sort of joking. But, there's probably, 300 people on planet Earth, probably not that many, that have something like a limitless mindset, where their mind is just on this total exponential growth curve. Now, this is the one that I'm constantly working to cultivate and maintain in myself, where I'd never stop asking the question, how can I 10x this? What would it look like if I had to accomplish my 1-year goals in a week, right? You think about that, it's a ridiculous question, because you have some sense that it might be impossible to do that. But the exercise is the point, because it encourages you to cut all of the fat and get really, really good at making the minimum necessary number of moves to accomplish your goal, which I think is, key to being effective. And I think it's also really, really valuable. Yeah, the point is, and the reason I'm talking about this is because I believe, and I will attempt to work on it as best I can, that we can help to cultivate culturally some sort of a system or some sort of appreciation for growth mindsets, for limitless mindsets. And I think people can cultivate them. In other words, people can gain or catch a growth or limitless mindset and not be stuck with a limited one. I don't think that this is a zero-sum contest where the world destabilizes if everybody wants to be better, right? I think this is the problem, is that our intuitions are mismatched, because there's one problem, which is that we have to have people who sweep, who clean houses and put roofs on houses, and people who work at the grocery stores and so on and so forth, in the bank, or maybe just imagine your most boring sort of mouse and wheel job. We have to have people who do those jobs, or somebody has to do those jobs, even if we're talking about robots. I think the thing that we miss is that if the system is working correctly, in my estimation, we're supposed to have kids to do bad jobs, right? Underskilled people who don't have an education, who need money badly, not like middle-aged people working in shitty jobs with little to no economic significance and no sense of fulfillment. Like, adults should be doing creative work that makes them feel good and that adds real value to the world, like solving actual problems. There isn't a downside to a person sweeping a house thinking about a more effective and efficient way of sweeping the house. If you approach things from a systems perspective rather than from a sort of personal labor perspective, you just make the world a better place, right? So I think the more and more people that we get thinking in those terms, the better. So pivoting a little bit, something else I want to strike on quickly is meditation. I've talked about this before. I've talked about this with Brian on the Homegrown Intellectuals podcast, and I don't think I've talked about it yet here on Fourth Eye, but just briefly, I think as many people probably know, meditation is incredibly powerful for cultivating a sense of present state awareness, for developing a detached relationship from your thoughts, and for really being able to have an incredible degree of emotional control and an incredible ability to choose how you react to things, which isn't something that I think many people are good at. I think it's a skill that we ought to encourage more people to get. I think if we taught meditation in school, we'd be living in a completely different planet. But I'm not an expert meditator. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, I don't have a regular meditation practice. So rather than give you my 3 cents on what good meditation looks like, I would just encourage you to go check out, somebody who knows what they're talking about in meditation, whether that's, Sam Harris or Joseph Goldstein, or whether that's, sort of Tara Brach or whatever it is. The version that I like personally is mindfulness meditation. Certainly there's other forms of transcendental meditations and things like that. And certainly there's a case to be made for meditation via exercise or, sort of being in a flow state and all this. So it's not just about meditating. It's about being able to turn on, or really at all times be in a state of being present, living in now, and really spending a little time thinking about the past or worrying about the future. And it sounds sort of anxiety-inducing, but what you realize is that anxiety is coming from the fact that you're worrying about all the things that will go wrong. But if you push that away and recognize that nothing's going wrong now, and in fact, you don't have to lie to yourself about the likelihood of things going wrong in the future to realize that anxiety isn't there. Because, right, this might sound weird, but even if you had good reason to think someone was going to kill you tomorrow, being anxious now isn't going to make it better, right? So that's sort of my 2 cents on that. So just, find some meditation practice if you're curious that works, basically. I don't really have much more to say about it than that. I could get into the details of what I think you should look out for, but I imagine that a different meditation practice will work differently for different people. In my experience, the things that work best for me is when I don't try to not think, but when I realize that thoughts are normal and that I don't really get to control them, but I can choose how I interact with them. So if I think of being an observer, or being my body is a better way of putting it, being a locus, and this might not make sense to people who haven't meditated, but I'm going to say it anyway, being a locus of sensations sort of on a bench, watching my thoughts pass by and choosing whether or not I interact with them is really powerful. But anyway, that kind of wraps that up. And we've already sort of talked a little bit about the real world application, but meditation and changing your mindset and all this will, as you can probably imagine, make it infinitely easier to accomplish one's goals and really do anything in life. Being in a state of present state awareness, really just, it is probably the single most important thing for feeling fulfilled, regardless of what's happening, whether you are making enough money, you have enough to eat, you're healthy, or if you're not, you can still be happy and be peaceful in any situation. So this is seriously powerful. And it changes even the most mundane things, right? Somebody cuts in front of you in a line at the grocery store, and you're not fuming, right? You kind of let it happen, or you calmly walk up and say, hey, you cut me off, and the other person's cool about it, they move out of the way, or maybe they're not having a good day and they get into an argument, but the way that you respond to all that stuff is totally different. Or somebody cuts you off in traffic, same thing. You don't think the worst possible story about them. You go, you know what, maybe they're taking somebody to the hospital, or maybe they're just stressed out, or whatever it is, maybe they eat too much sugar, I don't know. But you stop having damaging stories about the things that are happening, and you realize that there really isn't any way to know why bad things or good things are happening, but what you can be is in a state of peace, and what you can be is present, such that you can enjoy when you're having dinner with your friends or with your partner or whatever more, or hanging out with friends or playing with kids if you have them, and so on and so forth, and just enjoy the everyday experiences and have more of or enjoy the sort of peak experiences and be less hurt by the downs in life, and so on and so forth, and the grief, and be able to see those things differently. So anyway, I hope that this podcast was valuable and maybe it kind of got you thinking about your mindset and about sort of meditating or other things that you might be able to do to change the perception that you have of the world, to change your relationship with thoughts, and to create a sense of peace and a sense that you can, and really that you want to live in the present moment. Another thing that Sam points out is that the reason that we're chasing all these goals to make money and this and that is so that we can find good enough reasons to be in the present, to just relax. And the problem is that there's always another goal, right? So that day never comes. But if you make that day all the time and just say, you know what, I'm just going to be regardless of what's happening, then you actually find that happiness that you've been chasing. And the realization for me that it's not something out there, but it's actually something that you possess inside yourself, not deeply, but actually at the most basic level, right? The state of consciousness that you can drive a car in is the same state that you can be fulfilled and feel present in. So hopefully that is some sort of useful food for thought. And if you enjoyed the podcast, I look forward to your feedback and comments. I will be reading them. So anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and have a great day.